State Park. My name is Rich Padover. I'm the summer interpretive tour guide here. And today we are having our Bring Your Own Lunch presentation, August 21st. The second last one of the current summer season. So next Wednesday, the 31st, will be the last one. And then we are still looking into extending this, doing a version of this during the upcoming off-season now in the fall. If we do this, the Friends will get notified, members of the Friends group, and then we will also try to get a notice out to the general public as well. All right, but we are thinking of trying to extend this on a limited basis, see how it goes during the off-season coming up in September now. But again, we will get a word out if we do continue with this, okay? So today we have a presentation on Olmstead, Frederick Law Olmstead in the Merrimack Valley, and the presenter is Britt Bauner, a former visitor services supervisor here at Lawrence Heritage. He and I worked together. Britt was here during 2022, and he and I worked together summer of 2022. Had a great time working with Britt, and I'm pleased that he agreed to come back now and do a Bring Your Own Lunch presentation, so we appreciate that. So Britt, I will turn the program over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Hey, you're welcome.
As Rich mentioned, I was the Visitor Services Supervisor in 2022, and in addition to being the Visitors Supervisor in 2022, I'm also an amateur historian. So I love local history. So I'm going to make some excuses here before I get started. I don't have my notes, so all I have are the pictures that you see up here. See if you can see them. There we go. So I'm just going to kind of wing it, and we'll just go from there. All right. So, does anybody know who Frederick Law Olmstead is? I know Jim knows who he is. Was he a journalist, social critic? I spelled Civil War wrong, but Civil War sanitation administrator, scientific farmer, gold mine superintendent, landscape architect? Which one of these things was he? Does
all of the above.
All of the above, correct. You're right, Rich. He was all of the above. He's what you might call a polymath, I guess, a Renaissance man, perhaps. Okay, so this is a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk about Frederick Law Olmstead very briefly, about his biography. Unfortunately, I don't have my notes, so I can't get into too much detail, but that's fine. You're probably better off without it. There's a lot of dates in there. And then I'm going to talk about the Olmstead projects in the Merrimack Valley of Massachusetts. And then, if anybody has any questions at the end, I'll try to answer them or pass them off to Jim. He knows more about it than I do. I also have this blue star, which I'm calling the fun facts, and I'm also calling it also known as the research rabbit hole. So when you're looking up this stuff, you have a tendency, or I do, you have a tendency to kind of go down this rabbit hole and you find other things and other connections, sort of like history is a spider web, goes all over the place. So history is always connected, past, present, and future. All right, so we're going to talk very briefly about Olmstead, Frederick Law Olmstead. He was born in Hartford, Connecticut, April 26, 1822. His father was John Olmstead. He was a dry goods merchant. A dry goods merchant was sort of a precursor to what you might call like a department store, food store. He was a very successful man in Hartford. And John he was married, and he lost his wife. He had a young wife, and he lost his wife to, see if I can pronounce this correctly, Ladolum? It's like, it's an opium-laced drug. Laudanum? Laudanum, I can't say it, but anyway. It was a common drug back then that was prescribed for everything. So all kinds of ills, you would take laudanum. And so unfortunately, his wife had a toothache, and she took this, and she took too much of it, and she overdosed. So, and Olmstead was a witness to this. He was 3 years old, and he happened to walk into the room, and he saw it, but he sort of he had a vague memory of it. It was so traumatic that he really never really wanted to talk about it throughout his life. So, John remarried, and then they went on to have 6 more children. And Frederick Law Olmstead had a younger brother, John Olmstead. So he had 2 with their first mother, and then when John Olmstead remarried, they had 6 more children. So Olmstead, his schooling at a young age was sort of peripatetic. It wasn't a lot of schooling. Right after his mother's death, he was kind of shuffled around to other places, mostly tutors at like parishes that would teach him, and then that wouldn't work out, and then he would go somewhere else. So that's sort of what his education was like. He went to boarding school, he didn't last long there. He actually had a tutor at Phillips Academy, a math teacher that became his tutor. And he was studying surveying at the time, but he didn't really like it, and he only lasted a few months. The thing that you have to remember about Olmstead is that up until he becomes what he's known for, and that is a landscape architect, is that he did a lot of different things. And especially in his younger age, he didn't stick to them, but he took something from everything that he did. So even though he didn't last long as a surveyor, he was an apprentice, he still took something from that. He also was an apprentice for a dry goods importer of French silk in New York City, and he went to live in Brooklyn. This is when he was around 18 years old, and this was a job that his father got him, and that didn't last very long at all. And he lived in Brooklyn, and he used to visit the cemetery out in Brooklyn, which was a rural cemetery at the time. I think it was called Greenwood, and it was one of the first rural cemeteries in the country, and it actually came after Mount Auburn, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Other things I can tell you a little bit about from these images up here is that later on in life, he had a brother, John, and his brother, who he was very close to, dies of tuberculosis, which was a common disease back in the 19th century, along with cholera, the waterborne disease. And he married his brother's widow, and he adopted 3 of their children. So Olmstead, he also took a trip when he was a young man. He took a trip to China, and he was gone for a year. He sort of did that on a whim. He had read something in a book, or he had talked to some friends about, going to, far off places, and he decided that, well, that's the thing I'm going to do. I'm a young guy. I'm going to, check it out. And he was gone for a year. During that voyage to Canton, which is now called a different name, Guangzhou. Okay. It's one of the main cities in China. While he was on that trip, he got seasick. He came down with scurvy. He had typhoid. Now Olmstead was always kind of a sickly guy anyway. He had sumac poisoning when he was very young, got in his eyes. He had a limp because he had fallen off a carriage. So even though he was an adventurous guy, he still had all of these different problems that he had to contend with throughout his life. But he goes over to China, and it wasn't a very, it was kind of I think if he had his druthers, he would have not done it, but he still took something from it. He actually later on in life, he used what he saw over in Canton. I'm going to call it Canton, it's easier for me to pronounce. He took what he gathered from that, and he used it in some of his projects later on. seeing some of the topography and the way things were laid out, some of the architecture as well. So Olmstead finally starts to find his rhythm with farming. And at the time it was called scientific farming. And his father, and this was out in Staten Island, his father actually funds a farm, pays for a farm, or he pays the mortgage. And so this is where Olmstead starts to kind of get his footing in working with agriculture and that sort of thing. And then that farm falls into, the building is kind of in disrepair, and so they move to another farm. And this farm is called Tossamark Farm. And this is on Staten Island. And the building is still there, and there's some efforts to try to renovate the property, but this is Olmstead's second farm. And this is where he really starts to take off with scientific farming. And he's getting into all kinds of different, at the time a lot of people were experimenting with pollination and taking two vegetables and fruits and mixing them together and trying to come up with a crop that would last longer. For example, has anybody ever heard of Ephraim Bull? Ephraim Bull is the gentleman that came up with the Concord grape. So, and he just got into it, and he, again, was crossbreeding these different grapes to come up with a grape that would last long and be, less susceptible to insects and that sort of thing. So Olmstead was into this sort of thing. He was actually a farmer for 7 years, roughly, and then he gets into his late 20s. Let's see what we got over here. And he goes over, he's at this farm on Staten Island, and he's doing well, and all of a sudden, he has his brother and their close friend, Charlie Brace, are going over to Europe on a 6-month tour. And Olmstead wants to go. And he wants to go because he wants to see the sights of Europe, but he also wants to talk to some of the scientists and the farmers, and he was on a mission to sort of see if he could gather some knowledge about agriculture, some new ideas and that sort of thing. But yet, he's a farmer. He has to watch the farm and make sure that the crops are harvested and all that. But his father, actually being a nice guy that he was, decides that, because Olmstead didn't have the money, he gets the money from his father. So Olmstead and his brother John and his friend Charlie Brace, they go over to Europe, they do the grand tour, they go all over, see different countries, and they end up in, I'm not sure if they ended up in England, but they're in England, and Olmstead comes across Birkenhead Park. Now, Birkenhead Park was created by this gardener. His name is Joseph Paxton. So that's Joseph up there. And this is the first real public park in England. Okay, they had, prior to that, you had gardens, but they were usually owned by wealthy people, and depending on, when the wealthy people wanted to allow people onto their property to hang out, what depended on, their goodwill. And there were also estates that were turned over to the government periodically, but this was really the first park that was devoted as a public park. And Olmstead was really impressed by it. He saw this, and light bulbs went off. Joseph Paxton is an interesting guy, and he built the Crystal Palace, which you see there up on the right. And they had exhibitions in the Crystal Palace, and Joseph Paxton was a gardener. He was like the head gardener for a duke, and I'm trying to remember the name of it was called Chadwick or something like that. But if you look at the Crystal Palace, what I find interesting, and there was also a Crystal Palace in New York City, is that he created greenhouses. And he created greenhouses. He kept working with them, and he created greenhouses that became so structurally sound, because prior to that you didn't really have greenhouses that could stand up to the weather and that sort of thing. And so he took this Crystal Palace is basically an extension of the greenhouse. And so this is a big, huge exhibition hall. And as kind of a little, down the rabbit hole thing, Charles Goodyear, does that name sound familiar to anybody? Goodyear tires? Okay, so Charles Goodyear is a gentleman that didn't discover rubber, but he came up with the process to make rubber more malleable. And he had an exhibit at the Crystal Palace. So, and rubber prior to that was very brittle, and it would melt during the hot weather. It was brittle during the cold weather, but he had come up with a process. Vulcanization just came to me that would revolutionize the rubber industry. So he had an exhibit there. And the other, little blue star note here is that Joseph Paxton, because he was a head gardener actually, and England was importing seeds and plants from their empire, from other countries, and Joseph Paxton was experimenting again with the crossbreeding of seeds and that sort of the cross-pollination of seeds, and he was the one who came up with this banana. This is called the Cavendish banana, and it's named after a duke. If I had my notes, I would know which, I think it was the 6th Duke or something. But this banana right here that we all enjoy today is because of this man, Joseph Paxton. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Mount Auburn Cemetery. So Mount Auburn Cemetery, as we all know, is in Cambridge. It was the first rural cemetery in the country, 1831. It was created by this guy, I think his name is James Bigelow. And James Bigelow, I don't know if you can see it, he's up there in the right-hand corner. He was a botanist, he was an illustrator, a botanist illustrator. He was a physician, and he thought that cemeteries themselves, he didn't think that they were very sanitary. So he kind of came up with the idea to create this garden cemetery. And he partnered with the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, and they created Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is parts of Watertown and Cambridge. It's a beautiful cemetery. If you've never been there, I highly recommend it. A lot of famous people are buried in the cemetery. So this is Mount Auburn, 1831. And this was a place where a lot of people would go to on a Sunday stroll. They'd have picnics in the cemetery, and that was because they were trying to escape what was happening in the cities. The cities were just, the populations and the development was just rapidly advancing. So this was a place, a respite, a place to escape to. So these became popular, and as I mentioned earlier, the one in Brooklyn, I think it's Greenwood, Greenwood came after this, I think it was 1838. So this was a place that people would go to, and unlike today, people in the 19th century were dealing with a lot of different. So it wasn't uncommon for people to lose children, and in fact, Olmstead himself lost a couple of kids, and his father, he lost his step brothers and sisters. So it was a common thing. So walking through a cemetery and being surrounded by people who were buried in the cemetery, it didn't really scare people that much. They were sort of used to it. But it was also a beautiful place to be, and it still is. So I want to talk a little bit about this guy, Andrew Jackson Downey, and he had a huge influence on Olmstead. They had met when Olmstead was being a farmer, and he just ran into him somewhere. He was picking up something, and he just ran into this guy who is like the preeminent landscape architect, and he had a magazine or a newsletter or something. I'm not sure what you call it, but it was, I think it was called Horticulture. Anyway, it was a very popular magazine for the scientific farmers. And Olmstead started writing letters to this magazine, and he became a friend of A.J. Downing, Andrew Jackson Downing. Another blue star down to the rabbit hole is that unfortunately he died young. I think he was 37, and he died in a steamboat race. So it was common back then for steamboats to race with each other and also race with trains. And what happened is that this was on the East River, and they were racing. It was near Albany, I believe, and no, I think it was near the Bronx. And what happened is that it overheated the engine. So these were steam engines, and it just caught on fire. And they didn't have enough lifeboats, they didn't have enough life preservers, and something like 50 people died. People were burned to death, people were drowned, and unfortunately he was one of those people. And he was one of those people that at the time was very influential. His loss was a big loss. And at the time, he had been, there was a lot of discussion, we're talking around begins in the 1840s. As I mentioned, cities are starting to become really crowded, especially New York, Lower Manhattan. There's really not much green space left. So the push to create Central Park becomes, or not, they didn't call it Central Park, but it's to create some type of green space so people could come and escape the city for a while, started to become part of the discussions. Civil leaders were a part of the discussion. Bryant, who was a newspaper owner, as well as Downing, who had the Horticulture magazine, they were pushing for it. So this started to become a popular idea, the creation of some type of park. And so Downing had passed, and so now you have Olmstead, who had been not really necessarily working with him, but had been close to him. This other gentleman on the right, he doesn't get enough mention. I'm sure you can see him, but it's peeking from the side there. His name is Calvert Vaux, and he was an English architect that Downing had met in England. He was over there and he saw some of Vaux's watercolors, and he was impressed. And at the time, Downing was looking for a partner to join him in his architectural firm, landscape architecture, and that sort of thing. And so he invited Vaux to come over and join his firm, which he did. So Olmstead, who had no experience with creating a park, was hired by Vaux, and the two of them developed this plan called the Greens Board Plan. And this was a plan that was a design contest to create this space in the middle of Manhattan. And they won the design contest to create Central Park, which it began in 1858. And then took a couple of years, and then it was finally completed after the Civil War. But yeah, Olmstead worked for him, and another interesting thing was that one of the reasons why they located the park in this area was that the Croton tank, the reservoir, was centrally located in the park. And the gentleman who was the head of the Croton Aqueduct water company that supplied water to New York City wanted to create the park in that space. He wanted the tank to be part of the park, which it is. The aqueduct has since sort of been rerouted, but originally that's really one of the reasons why they had it located there. This is just kind of another rabbit hole thing, is that, people think that, you know, when they create these beautiful parks, it's all well and good, but if you have people already living there, then it's not really good for them. So New York, the space where they decided to create Central Park, it was a shanty town. And it's derogatory, I should say. But you had like roughly about 1,600 people living there. You had free slaves living there, you had Irish folks living there, and they owned property. And they lived and they owned that property. And they were kicked out by eminent domain. You get to the Great Depression, and Central Park becomes another place for the homeless. And they were called, it was called Hooverville. And we had these Hoovervilles all over the country because of the Great Depression. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room probably knows why they're called Hoovervilles. Richlands. Anybody know?
President Woodward was not something like that.
Well, they blamed the Depression on Hoover. They said it was all his fault. But there's more to the story than that. But so yeah, this was during the Great Depression. So Central Park has had sort of its, you know, it's had its various phases over the years. All right. So during the Civil War, I should say, Olmstead, you know, he becomes the sanitation director, which at the time, and this is during the Civil War, and this is I forget the name of it. It's the Sanitation Administration. But basically what this is, it's a precursor to the Red Cross. And so he's working with the Army and taking care of people. He's the one at the top of it. He's the organizer. And so he's the guy that's in charge of this massive organization that's helping the wounded, take care of the wounded during the Civil War. On the left, this is one of Olmstead's books. He wrote books. He wrote books about, he took a tour of the South, and he wrote about the conditions that the slaves were experiencing. And he went to Texas, he wrote about that experience, and I forgot to mention that while he was in England on the Grand Tour, he also wrote a book about his experiences in England, which A.J. Downing, a previous friend there, published in his magazine. Gave it a great review, I should say. Olmstead, being the adventurous person that he is, he went and during the Civil War, around that time period, he took over a gold mining company. He became the administrator out there. And unfortunately, the gold mine company went bust, and so he came back, and then he and Vox continued their partnership after the Civil War, and they were quite successful. They created a number of parks, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, and they were involved in the Riverside development, which was a suburb in Chicago, the first planned suburb in the country. So I mentioned Riverside on the left. This is a planned space that Vox and Olmstead created, and there were thousands of Olmstead senior projects, I should say. Too many to mention. But the other one I'd like to mention is the World's Columbian Exposition, in Chicago in 1893. It was like a World's Fair. They called it the Chicago World's Fair as well. And Olmstead was in charge of the grounds, and so it was Chicago World's Fair. They also called it the White City because of the buildings themselves. But this was to celebrate the Columbus, supposedly discovering America 400 years prior. So, and this fair was also held not too long after the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. So it was kind of a way to show off the city of Chicago. And a lot of firsts at the fair. One of them was the Ferris wheel. So everybody knows what a Ferris wheel is. You can't really see it down the corner very well. But the Ferris wheel was first introduced at the Chicago World's Fair. And George Ferris Jr. was the gentleman who built it. And he had never built one before. And it was a first of its kind. And it was to sort of rival the Eiffel Tower that from another previous fair in Paris years earlier. So trying to show off that, hey, we can come up with some great idea as well. Really fascinating. I've read some stuff about the Ferris wheel before, but one of the things that really impressed me is not only the massiveness of it, but just the engineering of it as well. And each car held, just to give you an idea of how big this thing was, each car was like a bus. It held 40 people. It was enormous. Also at the World's Fair, there was a lot of food items that were introduced. There was cream of wheat, perhaps Blue Ribbon came into vogue during that time period. And many peanut butter, the brownie, and many others. Also, Cracker Jack. So this was sort of first introduced at the Chicago World's Fair. And I brought these, I was hoping those kids would be back, the camp kids. I mean, that's what I kind of brought them, but you guys can take some home for your own, children and grandchildren. Olmstead died at McLean Hospital in Belmont. He late 18, I had the date, it was 1908 actually. But in 1895, he started to have dementia. And unfortunately, he was admitted to the hospital and was there for a number of years. Ironically, he was admitted to McLean Hospital years earlier when McLean Hospital was being moved from Somerville to Belmont, and they had this piece of land. Olmstead had been consulted as far as how to lay out the grounds. They never followed his plan, but it's kind of, again, ironic that he ends up there. We all know about Boston's emerald necklace, or it's sort of something that we take for granted. I think we do. I do. I don't go to it often enough. It was a project that Olmstead was now living in Brookline, and he was living at his place called Fairstead in Brookline, which I've been to. I highly recommend it. It's a national park, and it's free. And so he was living in Brookline. He wanted to get away from New York City. He also lived very close to his good buddy H.H. Richardson, Henry Hobson Richardson, who has built a lot of things. We have buildings here in Lawrence, and Trinity Church in Boston is an H.H. Richardson building. There's a lot of H.H. Richardson buildings that are kind of copycats. But anyway, so Olmstead comes back to Brookline, and this is kind of like his last big project. And this is a project that lasts roughly for about 20 years. And it's called the Emerald Necklace. So you're linking up all the parks around Boston. It's starting with the Common, and then you've got the Arnold Arboretum, Franklin Park, Jamaica Pond, et cetera, the Back Bay Fens. And it's called the Emerald Necklace, but initially Olmstead wanted to call it the Emerald Girdle. It wasn't catchy, but that's what he wanted to call it. I don't know why, but. So again, another Blue Star rabbit hole quickly. Jamaica Pond was Boston's first water source, and they used to use wooden logs to transfer the water down into Boston, which was at a lower level. And you can't see it very well, but that's some example of some of the logs. And the water wasn't for everybody. It was only for those who were willing to pay for it. But Jamaica Pond, and one of the reasons why it became part of the Emerald Necklace is that when Olmstead wanted to include it because at that time Jamaica Pond was just becoming a sewer. And there was a quote about that time period about Boston, something like, you know Boston because you could smell it before you see it. And that was because of the Back Bay and the former mill ponds as well as Jamaica Pond. If the water's not flowing and people are dumping their trash, etc., and sewage, then that's what happens. All right, the 7 S's of Olmsted's design theory, and I had explanations for them, but I can't see them, but these are the 7. So basically, to sum up, sanitation, as you see, is 1. He wanted to make sure there's always good drainage. Of course, you didn't want to have sewage, backing up into your parks. I'll leave you with this. The best way to sum up Olmstead is that he wanted you to walk into a park and not know that you're in a park. So it's almost like you're walking through a park that is man-made, that's created, that dirt's been moved around, there are plantings, and he wanted you to feel that you were in some other place, kind of in the woods, but not really in the woods. And he wasn't big on angles, symmetry. He wanted you to, follow this linear path, and just sort of let yourself just kind of, just go through a narrow passage, and then all of a sudden they would open up into a vista, and then just, you see an outcropping of a rock or something like that. He liked pastoral, he liked non-linear. So that was his design. How many people have ever been to Central Park? I went to Central Park for the first time about 15 years ago, and I almost cried. I just was so impressed with Central Park. It was so moving to me. I just thought it was such a masterpiece. Keep in mind, when this was created, Central Park, we're talking the late 1850s. No buildings were around Central Park. So Vox and Olmstead had this vision of what Central Park would look like someday with buildings. And so they were way ahead of their time. And to me, it's just a masterpiece. Oh, I didn't mention the other, I summed it up, so that's good enough. We're gonna talk, how am I doing on time, Rich?
12:40, we're doing fine.
All right, good, all right, this is good. All right, so we're gonna get into the Olmstead family business. So, on the left, I don't know if you can see it, but I want to probably keep this light in here. But anyway, there was Frederick Law Olmstead, and there was, Calvin Vox. And so you have these, landscape architectural firms, which, by the way, landscape architecture is a term that Vox and Olmstead came up with. There was no such thing as landscape architecture prior to them coming up with the term. And so on the left is kind of a family tree of all the different architects that worked at the firm, which the firm was at Fairstead. So it was at Olmstead's house, and he had an office back there, a big office where the employees worked and where they kept all the drawings. And so this is the family tree on the left. A lot of, I don't know them very well, but other people who were in the field probably know them fairly well. You got these two gentlemen on the right. These are both Olmstead's sons. So they take over the firm after Olmstead is admitted to McLean. And John Charles Olmstead on the left is the half son. So when Olmstead married his brother's wife, the son, who was the nephew, became his son. He adopted him. So that's the gentleman on the left. And Frederick Law Olmstead Jr. is his son from when he married Mary Parkins or something Olmstead. She has a long name. Oops. Now, we're going to talk about the projects in the Merrimack Valley of Massachusetts. Okay. One of them being Phillips Academy in Andover. So the Olmstead brothers did a lot of work over many years. They talk about 5 decades. And keep in mind that it was called the Olmstead Brothers because of the two brothers. 1960, after the last brother left the firm, it was called Olmstead Associates because you had some of the architects who stayed on, but they didn't keep it brothers, they called themselves associates. So, should distinguish that. So they did a lot of work at Phillips Academy. Basically, they came up with a plan to connect the campus with the dormitories. Again, following in their father's footsteps. These guys, both, by the way, were both very accomplished. They worked on a lot of projects with their father. They had degrees and everything. So these guys were no slouches. And so anyway, the Phillips Academy campus was a project that they worked with the school for many years. Lucy Larkin Park in Lowell. Anybody know where that is? Yep. Okay, Lucy Larkin Park. So Lucy Larkin Park is a national park, and it used to be a street called St. Anne's Street, which is right next to St. Anne's Church. And so this is, and it's also next to the Merrimack Canal. So this is right near downtown, and they have a lot of art festivals, markets, that sort of thing. And this was a project that the Olmstead brothers worked on. And basically all they did was, the pathways, some of the foliage. So this was the only drawing I found in the archives, which were quite massive. I have a blue star again, Lucy Larkham. She was a mill girl. She ended up, she worked in the mills, and she was a poet. She wrote for this company-sponsored magazine called Lowell Offering. She went on to become an abolitionist. She was a Massachusetts teacher, and as I mentioned, she was a poet. All right, Academy of Notre Dame in Tingsboro. I don't know what their relationship is, the Olmstead brothers, but this drawing of the Academy was in there. The school moved to Tingsboro, we're talking around the 20s, and it has a really interesting backstory because the property was once owned by an actress named Nance O'Neill. Now, and Nance O'Neill, on the left-hand side, that was her mansion on this property. She went into debt, and she had to sell the property, and they sold it to the Academy of Notre Dame, who were in Lowell, actually, and so they moved their operation to Tingsboro. And interesting Blue Star rabbit hole connection is that Nance O'Neill was very good friends with Lizzie Borden. So she was the acquitted axe murderer, and they were very good friends. In fact, they were roommates. And there was some speculation that they were even closer than that, but there's no evidence to be found in that respect. And I wish Joe Bella was here because I'd asked him if Thelma, Thelma Todd knew Nance O'Neill, because they were both kind of in the same time period. So I thought that was really interesting. Tyler Park in Lowell. Anybody ever been to Tyler Park? It's one of the smallest parks in Lowell. It's in the Highlands section of Lowell. It was created by the Olmstead brothers, and they were working with Charles Eliot at the time, and this gentleman in the middle. And it's a very tiny park, a beautiful place. I've been there a bunch of times to see music concerts, and it's very well supported by the Friends of Tyler Park. They're very protective of the space. It's changed a little bit over the years. In the middle, they used to have a fountain, but now that's just sort of a bunch of rocks that are there. That gentleman in the middle is Charles Eliot. Charles Eliot worked with them. He worked on this park. Unfortunately, Charles Eliot died not too long after that of spinal meningitis. Charles Eliot is a hero if you know anything about local parks. He created the Boston Park System. The MDC. He created what is now the DCR today. He was part of it. He accomplished an incredible amount of things in his short life. I think he, again, was in his late 30s when he died from that disease. Mill Pond development in Littleton. This is 1972, so this must be Olmstead Associates. And I find it interesting, it's 1972, and they're talking about creating space for 1,244 cars. So they're into the parking lots, but as well as the foliage. I'm not sure if they did the architecture, because it doesn't look like something they would do. They may have been involved, or whoever the architect was. It wasn't, it's certainly not, something I would recognize at all. But, looking at the Google Maps, you see a lot of foliage. You see a lot of a canopy of trees around it. So it still has that Olmstead element. Wilmington High School, 1950, brand new high school. That again, it looks like they were more involved, Olmstead brothers, than, or the Olmstead, no, they're still the brothers. It looks like they did build the high school because I found several plans, architectural drawings, so I'm pretty sure it was them. I also did some digging into, I was looking for correspondence on certain projects, and it was a little difficult to find, so I don't know for sure, but seeing all the drawings, I'm pretty sure they did both. This thing in the middle, this dedication booklet, was found in a time capsule when they went to build a new high school in Wilmington. The old one was torn down in 2013, and they built a new high school in the same spot. Methuen Town Hall. So this is 1954, I think it is. And originally the drawings show a police station and a town hall, but it's now just a police station, as far as I know, as far as I can tell. And so this drawing here at the bottom is this sculpture here. If anybody knows where this is, if it ever happened, please let me know, because that was part of the project. I find it very sort of, 1950s, 50s-ish. Now we get into something interesting. And now we get local, Lawrence. Anybody know where the John A. Eldred Memorial Chapel is located?
Water Street.
Yes. Okay.
You get married in the church.
You did. Did you know the history of it?
No.
Okay. So the history of it is that this gentleman down in the right-hand corner, John Edward Aldred, had that chapel built in honor of his father, who was a teacher at the church, which is called the Riverside Congregational Church.
Yeah, that's the one.
And what had happened is that they were in another location, and they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. Again, we're talking the 1920s, I think it is. They were celebrating their 50th anniversary, and part of the foundation collapsed. So they didn't know what to do, and this gentleman, John Edward Eldred, stepped in and bought them a new chapel. And so these are the plans on the left. I'm not sure if the Olmstead brothers built it, but I'm pretty sure that they did the landscaping. And in the original plans, that red circle, it says Christmas tree. And maybe the Christmas tree was once there and they cut it down, but I look for it, I don't see it. But you drive by and it's beautiful. It's this little church surrounded by beautiful trees. Interesting is that John Edward Alfred also built that chapel on the right-hand side, and that is in a town in New York, and that was in honor of his mother. And they look very similar. And what happened to John Edward Eldred, I should just say John Eldred, it's a hard name for me to say, is that he went bankrupt. And they were looking for like a continuing endowment to support the maintenance of the church. And unfortunately, by 1941, he didn't have any more money left. He was a guy that was a wealthy industrialist. He was in charge of water companies. He was head of Gillette, like chairman of the board of Gillette Razor Company. Very wealthy, but unfortunately, he lost all his money. UMass Lowell, Connick Hall, and administration buildings. I went to UMass Lowell. So again, you see these drawings and you see that there's a lot of plantings and foliage, and interesting to look to see if any of it's still there. I think that some of it's still there from the aerial view, but I don't know for sure because I'm not a horticulturalist. But I do know that the flagpole that was in the original drawing is still there. That's the red. Indicating where the flagpole is. That's still in the same location. Tavern Acres in North Andover. This is a little park that was created by this gentleman right here, Henry Vincent Hubbard, who worked for the firm. And this is a little sort of suburb in North Andover, and they created, and it's interesting when you look at the Phillips Academy information, you see developments all around Phillips Academy that a lot of the Olmstead architects were involved in a lot of housing projects, this being a little further north. All right, here we are for the common improvement timeline. Okay, I can read this. 1894, city votes 4,595 to 498 to accept Chapter 154 of the Acts of the Massachusetts Legislature of 1882 entitled An Act to Authorize Towns and Cities to Lay Out Public Parks Within Their Limits. 1895, Mayor appoints Board of Park Commissioners and they take possession of many of the parks in Lawrence, including the Common Park, which is what it was called back then. And so by possession, I don't think they took it by eminent domain. I think they bought it, so maybe they did take it by eminent domain, but I think it was, they bought the land. 1895, they viewed creating parks as a business investment because other cities with park systems have found them profitable due to taxable property near parks, which makes sense. So you see these parks, and then if you have a green space, then you have houses around it, then that sort of increases the property values. So that's common sense. 1895, they received a plan from Olmstead, and these are the brothers, by the way. Well, maybe 1895, maybe, no, I don't think so. I don't think Frederick was involved anymore, but who knows. I couldn't find any of the correspondence. I went to the Library of Congress, and it didn't, the letters that I was looking at didn't match the numbers I was given. But anyway, received plan from Olmstead and adopted by commissioners. Improvements can be added gradually at a reasonable annual expense, and when completed, the Common Park will be vastly improved and rank with the best of the small parks in this country. 1895, Lawrence in a few years may have a system of parks within its thickly settled portion which shall be ornaments and blessings to its people without an exorbitant outlay of money or a burden on its taxpayers. So I found all this information in the Lawrence City annual reports, thanks to Anita Kelly over at the Lawrence History Center. And a couple of drawings. You see how, you don't see the plan evolve too much for the common. Again, all they're doing here is they're basically creating new paths. They've got some new plants that they're putting in, shrubs, trees, etc. So the plan on the left, December 23rd, 1895, is not that different from the January 22nd, 1896 plan. But then you get to this plan, February 24th, 1896, and all of a sudden you see this playground that's been added to the plan. And so there was a little bit of a change there, I guess. But otherwise, not much change since the initial proposal. On the right is 1/2 of a stereograph. Is anybody familiar with a stereograph? Jim's familiar. Sort of like, it's like a viewfinder. Remember the viewfinders? Yeah, this is
Viewmaster.
Viewmaster. And so I found this photo, and this was in Digital Commonwealth, and it says 1870 to 1900, and I'm pretty sure this photograph was taken like the 1897, something like that, because what you see those paths, and you see the trees that have been planted in that area. I was looking at this photograph, and of course it's got two images side by side, because it's a stereograph, and it gives that a 3D effect. And I'm looking at the photograph, and I'm going, oh wow, there were two ponds. And it took me to come, it's like, no, you're looking at the same image. Anyway. It's just like, wow, they added another pond. No, they didn't add another pond. This is something else I found in the city reports. 1896-97, the Common Park has been cared for in the usual way by planting of flower beds, by keeping the lawns well cut, paths repaired, and a few trees removed, which were superfluous. Many more trees need to be taken out to preserve the symmetrical growth of those left. Some typos in there from me. But anyway, you see how much they paid the landscape architect $257.06, which back then was probably a lot of money. So you know that that's when that happened, that this is when the Olmstead brothers were involved by the planting. So if you went back to that photograph, you could actually say 1896 instead of 1870 to 1890. This is what the common looks like today. Maybe not its best day, and it looks like a hot, dry summer day when this Google photo was taken. But it looks like a lot less greenery than the original plan, unfortunately. All right, finally ending with the little shout out to the DCR, all the parks that are throughout the state, over 150 or so, something like that. And the green space that they owned is 10% of Massachusetts, right? Is that the?
Ask him.
Okay, well, I know it's supposed to be 450,000 acres,
Yeah.
but what percentage that represents of the whole land area in Massachusetts, I don't know.
Yeah, I thought it was, make it easy to 10%, so it's kind of impressive. So I mentioned, sorry.
Works for me.
So I mentioned Fairstead. This is Frederick Law Olmstead's home and workspace, workplace. This is where, at the peak in 1930, the Olmstead brothers had something like 60 employees that worked in this house. And these are some of the drawings, plans that are still there. And if you make arrangements with the National Park and these folks here, it's a free place to go to. I've been there. It's wonderful. They have tour guides. They have, you can see movies and all kinds of things while you're there. It's great. It's a great take.
I'm sorry, where's that again?
That is in Brookline. Yeah, it's a great, nice day trip. I have all my life been considering distant effects and sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future, the visionary, Frederick Law Olmstead. This portrait, by the way, was created by Sargent. What's his first name?
John Singer.
Yeah, thank you, John Singer Sargent. I didn't have my notes. And so he created this, I think Olmstead was staying at the Biltmore Hotel. Where is that? I had my notes, but I don't know where it is. But anyway, he was at this hotel, and Sargent wanted to create his portrait, and Olmstead's wife was worried that, because he was getting up there in age, she didn't want Sargent to depict him in sort of a negative light. And you notice he's got a cane. It could be very well that because of his age, but also the fact that he did have a limp throughout his life, and he did use a cane. So Sargent, you want to see some Sargent, go over to the Addison Museum of American Art. They have plenty of Sargent. I'm a regular there, and that's it. It's a cracker jack. Oh, questions? Yeah.
Rick, I'll make a statement, a statement. You mentioned Mount Auburn Cemetery earlier in Cambridge, and there are many luminaries buried there, as I think you mentioned. One of them being Charles Storrow, right? One of the founding fathers of Lawrence. So, yes.
Among many others.
Yes.
The third drawing of the Lawrence project, I have seen that before, here or at the Lawrence History Center. And you mentioned a playground.
Yeah.
But there's kind of an oval
Yeah.
in that. Is that what you're calling the
Yes.
playground?
Yeah, it says playground in it.
It does?
It does.
All right, okay. Because I saw that and I realized there is no oval on the common, so I thought that the Olmstead firm was consulted, but that their work wasn't implemented. But maybe some of it, from the first and second drawings, were implemented, but that part was not.
That playground comes later. So that's 1896, the other drawings are earlier. Like all those drawings are within like a year, and I tried to get, there's some correspondence about that project. And as I said, I went to the Library of Congress, and the numbers that I was given didn't match up with the letters I was finding. So that was frustrating, because I thought, haha. But, because it would have been nice to know what the Olmsteads were, what the correspondence said, basically. So, anyway. Any other questions?
Did you try, you didn't by any chance try the city?
I didn't try the city, no.
I think a lot of those records got thrown in the dumpster, but the History Center saved some of it, but who knows?
It was Olmstead, then Olmstead Brothers, then Olmstead Associates.
Yes.
Are they still in existence?
They are not in existence. So these firms, they may be something else, but once the junior, Frederick Law Olmstead Jr. left in he was 1957. 1960, the firm was being called Olmstead Associates. And I don't think it exists anymore under that name. I think it's probably called something else. I'm not sure.
Two things. One, it was great. My wife is going to be sorry she missed it. And the second one is the Lawrence Cemetery is considered a garden cemetery. There used to be 2 ponds up there, and I read descriptions of people doing the same thing you talked about, going up there and having picnics and stuff like that.
Yeah. What better place to be than in a cemetery? I go there quite often. I go to cemeteries all the time. I find them very peaceful.
I'm going as soon as I get here. I look up stuff for people.
Are you good?
Yeah. They're looking for pictures of gravestones of their relatives, and they may live in another country or a different part of the United States.
Interesting. Any other questions? Yes?
A comment rather than a question. And of course,
My typos?
I have to, no, not at all. It's very good. But I wanted to add something just for people's interest, perhaps. You mentioned that he did a number of things before becoming a landscape architect, including 7 years as a farmer. But journalist was one of the things you mentioned.
I didn't go into it.
And, you didn't have time because it's such a rich subject. But it's very interesting because in the 1850s, before the landscape architect career, he was a journalist for a while, and he traveled through the American South. And at the time when we were in this great ferment leading up to the Civil War and the controversy about slavery, so he wrote reports as he traveled through the South about what Southern society was like. And before he went down there, he wasn't particularly pro or con slavery. He was like a lot of people in the North, because abolitionists were a radical fringe, actually. But as he traveled through the South, he became increasingly appalled by what he saw in slavery, and eventually was writing very much against it. So his reports that were published, I think, in a New York newspaper, but
New York
probably
Times.
elsewhere,
It wasn't called the New York Times back then. It was called New York Daily Times, something like that.
They were very well read across the North and really contributed to and ultimately collected in a book, and really contributed to anti-slavery activity in the North.
When he was the sanitation commissioner, I believe, again, it was sort of a precursor to the Red Cross, he also recruited black folks for the 3 regiments, I think, for they called them the colored troops, the New York City colored troops. And he did that. He went out and recruited those folks. So he also wrote other books about travels to Texas, travels to Mexico. He did it all. It was amazing.
You know if Olmstead had anything to do with the design of the Lawrence Cemetery?
I don't know. I didn't find anything. I mean, if you go to the National Park site, they have some tools that you can use, and they have what they call a Flickr site. So it's Flickr is the photos, and they have an Olmstead site. and you punch in whatever you're looking for, and these, drawings or photographs pop up. And it's quite extensive. Not everything is on there, but that's where I found a lot of my information from that site. And they were very nice to me. I called them once, I was asking them about the correspondence between Olmstead and the City of Lawrence Park Commissioners. Again, they could see it, but they, again, transferred me to the Library of Congress, and then it didn't work out. And so I think this is, I think, what happens when you have so much information that's being digitized, and then it's on a database. And I think you have a lot of times volunteers, I shouldn't blame them, but it's hard to sort of keep track of all this stuff, and things can get misplaced. So I think a lot of the stuff was misplaced. And if you call them and say, hey, this is, I looked up this number and this is not what it is, and they'll look into it, but otherwise I don't think, they don't have the time or the people to do it. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, Steve.
Great.